Okay, I think we'll get started. Do you have to start or?
No, you just jump right in if you want.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I'll just do 5-minute warning.
Okay, 5-minute warning. Okay. This is the Archbishop of Strathroy. You've never met him. Good to be with you. My name is Steve Adams, part of the Adams family. You can tell by looking at me, probably. I know many of you, so some of you I don't know. What I'd like to do is I'd like to find out sort of the audience first, okay? So, are you here because you are in a regular teaching role and you want to have maybe a few tools in your toolkit in teaching to do with... I'm going to talk about storytelling and then I'm going to talk about humor as well, because I get paid more if I have two topics. I'm going to talk a little bit about humor, okay, because... yeah, that often is tied to storytelling. So is that why you're here? Just because you, okay? And how many of you have regular teaching ministries, like you're teaching, I don't care who it is, but you're teaching virtually every week or every Sunday or whatever? Okay, that's so loud. Okay, good. Okay, good stuff. Okay, great. Just a little bit about me. I was born a small child. Where do I start? I work for Feb Central part-time doing leadership work and church vitality work. So I do some cohorts, I do quite a few consultations where I go into churches. For 12 and a half years, I was the lead pastor at Forward Church in Cambridge. Some of you may know that church. And God was really kind while we were there. I became a pastor because they couldn't find this. You're going to think I'm jesting. But I became a pastor because they couldn't find a pastor. It was my home church. They couldn't find a pastor, and after a year and a half, somebody said, throw Adams in there. Yeah, can it get any worse? And that's not that far. That's not that far afield. So I had been a supported missionary suffering for Jesus in South Carolina during January. And so I moved back to Canada because we felt God called us back here. So I was there about 12 and a half years as lead pastor. God was very kind, and we saw about a little over 500 baptisms in 10 years. So that was kind of neat. Church grew, went to 3 sites, and then I was let go. No, I wasn't. But you own it. Boy, where's his head? No. So God called us to something new, and the church is doing well. We rejoice in that. And so I work part-time for Feb Central. The main work I do is I have a firm. I have a nice booth over there. You can go over and get yourself a free journal where I work with churches primarily in pastoral and staff search work. So I do that mostly in Ontario, sometimes a little farther. And at any one time, I'm doing 8 or 10 churches. And some of the people in this room have been a product of my involvement with their church. So it's good to see some of you that have gone through searches with me. And I'm in the witness protection program, so if you didn't take it. So that's a little bit about me. I think the reason in part why our church grew is, just so you know, churches, I do lead pastor searches like I'm doing probably 5 or 6 right now, our company, and nobody ever says, find us a lousy preacher, right? And what's made that even more significant is, right, because 4 or 5 clicks of a thumb and you can listen to the best preaching in the world, depending on what you sort of assimilate with or what you align with as far as the style, right? Okay? So the demand for good preaching and teaching has gone up fairly significantly, and a key component to that, I believe, is you have to be able to handle story well. I don't know if they're still running it. The most stimulating conference I ever went to was in Nashville, Tennessee, about 6 or 7 years ago, and the conference was called Story. And it was all about storytelling, and in fact, the guy that was leading it and emceeing it, I turned to the guy that I went with, I said, that guy's got to be a believer, he's got to be a Christian. Turns out he was a believer, he was a Christian. And so it had a lot of Christian themes and elements in it, weaved through it, and then one night, the guys from Delirious, remember the old band, the Christian band Delirious? They were there, they got up and they spoke at this totally secular thing, but they had people from major Fortune 500 companies talking about the power of story within their companies, and it was just really stimulating. So I think the power of story is so important. Who is the greatest storyteller that ever lived? Jesus, a masterful storyteller. And so you want to develop this, hone your skills. It is an art. and it is a science too. So there's two pieces to the puzzle. So we'll start. We're gonna talk about storytelling, and then I'm gonna take some time. We'll talk about humor, because humor also interfaces in that. And I've got some great stories to tell you of things not to do when it comes to humor in churches that I've offended all over the place. So we'll come to that. Okay, the power of story. So you have your notes there. Oh, let me do a little commercial as we start. You'll see at the bottom, one of the things we do at Feb Central is called Next Level Preaching. So we do a cohort. It's about, I think there's about 9 units in it. It's one morning a month from like September through till May. And what we do is we bring in some of the best preacher teachers in the fellowship, and they will come. And it's not designed to get into the theological weeds of Greek verbs, okay? It's designed to help you with very practical things to do with preaching and teaching, okay? And it's not just for guys, so ladies, this is not a guy-only thing. So we would love to have you be part of that. We're actually going to do an intensive where we're going to do it all in 2 days, probably at Fairview Baptist in Lindsay, end of September, early October. So if that's your neighborhood. So some of the guys that come and teach at it, Ashwin Ramani, who you'll hear tonight, who's, I would say, one of the best, probably the top 20 preachers in Canada, okay? He was at Center Street Church in Calgary, preached to 7,000 every weekend. But God called him to West Park. They had, I forget, 18 decisions on Easter Sunday morning and 41 rededications. Man, it's amazingly gifted. Indian, saved out of a Hindu background. You'll hear him tonight. You'll want to hear him. Amazing, humble. I just love the guy. He's a great guy. So he comes, Rick Buck, Tim Strickland, who you heard this morning. We've had Dwayne Klein, John Stairs, Rick Reed. So some really stellar communicators. So if you're interested in that, talk to us. We'd love to have you to be part of that. So this, what I'm going to share, is one of the units in that, okay, which is storytelling and humor, okay? So that's by way of introduction. Okay, the power of story. Why is story important? Why do we use story in a sermon? And when I'm talking about story, I'm talking about an illustration that might only be 2 or 3 sentences long, right? Something that's really quick and concise, or a very lengthy, well-developed sermon. I did a sermon probably 7 or 8 years ago as Matthew the tax collector, okay, in character, okay. I think 80% of the people thought it was cool and engaging, and 20% thought it was really weird. So, it didn't fit everybody. So I should come down to maybe do this round. But so that's a story. The whole time I was up there was a story, right? Telling a story. So this can have size, okay? So why is it so important? Because it illustrates, it lets people look in and see things that they wouldn't necessarily see because you attach to it, you put some handles on it by way of story. Tim this morning, he told the story of growing up and going out and riding his bike all day, right? And then he said, I'm not hungry. And then he said, he took that story and applied it over to Jesus, when they came back, they went into the town, they came back, they brought back KFC, which is kosher fried chicken. And he said, no, I'm not hungry, right? So that's what you're doing. You're doing that to take something and to illustrate it, and then to magnify it, to make it bigger. I told the story when I was pastoring I was doing a series on fear, a sermon on fear. And I told the story of, I said, is anybody claustrophobic? And one of the ways you use story well is, one of the ways you enter into a story well is to ask a question. So it invites people into the story. Anybody here ever been really afraid? Of course, everybody's going, oh yeah, I've been afraid. Yeah, me too. Let me tell you. Then you invite them into the story. But I told a story of imagine falling down a well that's the same size as you are, but you just slide right to the bottom. And you're down there for 24 hours. We had a lady in our audience that had happened to her. So I told the story, and then we showed video of the well and whatnot. And then the lady stood up, and then a bunch of people came to her at the end of the sermon to talk to her about fear and whatnot. It was just, so that whole story brought people into a whole different place that they otherwise would not have been. So it just takes it and it magnifies. It mirrors, right? It lets people see back on themselves. Okay? So it mirrors back to people a really good story. And it applies. A really good story, in some cases, it just brings about application. That's what Tim did, right, with the application of that. You know, I was hungry, we weren't hungry, brings application. So there's all these different ways that you can use story. Story is universal across all cultures. Every culture uses story. Now, how many of you are preaching or teaching to a multicultural context? Right? Many of you, and that's becoming increasingly so in our churches. So story allows you to enter into an experience with them that other things may not be. But story is universal across all cultures. That's why Jesus used it. Right? Ask somebody sometime, you know, if you meet somebody on the street, non-Christian, say, you know anything about the Bible? I'll guarantee you they will know a story in the Bible. They'll know the Good Samaritan. You know, they'll know a story in the Bible, okay? Because it's universal across all cultures. It invites the audience in, because if you tell a broadly applicable story, if you get into some really specific thing, not as much so, but if you tell a broadly applicable story, it will invite people in, because the essence or the theme of the story, they'll be able to apply to them. Fear, joy, disappointment, despair, all of these different things. A story regarding that, they'll say, oh, okay, yeah, I have a common experience. What does this say about my common experience of the topic at hand? I'll give you an example. A friend of mine pastors in California. Young couple in their church, missionary couple. Well, I'll tell you how I started. I said, has anybody here this morning, have you ever said, God, where are you? Are you out there, God? God's quiet. God's distant. God, where are you? God, where are you? Has anybody ever felt that way? So, you know, the people are not. I said, let me tell you about my friend Eric. He's a pastor in, I think I said California. He's in Colorado. He's a pastor in Colorado. Young couple in his church prepare for missionary service. As they're getting ready to go, they have a little baby. The church raises the money. They commission them. They send them to the mission field. They're in the mission field weeks. The mama is changing the baby on the bed. The baby's lying on the bed. Mama turns to get whatever. The ceiling fan is not anchored properly, and it comes down, and it kills the baby. Baby's killed. The couple comes home. They're devastated. Devastated. The church says, we got to do something for them. Let's do something nice, something that'll be life-giving. They send them off to one of these, you know, like Sandals Resorts or one of those things. You know, they send them off for 2 weeks. Beautiful, luxury, high-end, just go online. He dives into the wrong end of the pool. Fractures his neck. He's paralyzed from the waist down. Same couple. And then you pause. And you say, God, where are you? Where are you, God? When those things happen, where's God? So you see how you invite people in with that kind of story? Now, you tell that story appropriately. You don't say, and then a guy jumps in the pool, dude. That's insensitive, unkind. Contextually, you tell the story well, in the magnitude of what's happening. Some stories are really funny, and you tell it in a way that, you know, has winsomeness to it. But some stories are heavy, but they will invite people in. They can be different lengths. I mentioned that. It can invoke emotions that otherwise lie dormant, because people have entered into the story, and it's like, yeah, that's what happened to me. That's an experience. I told a story about a really painful thing that happened to me that I held on to, held anger towards this person. And 30 years after this person had wounded me so deeply as a teenager, probably 35 years after that, I saved that man's life. Just by complete God-architected circumstances. I saved the guy's life. Of the guy when I was a teenager who made me so angry and so mad I got fired from my job over it. So I told that story at a church, one of our churches, about 3 or 4 weeks ago. At the end of the story, a girl came up, a teenage girl, weeping, couldn't get a hold of herself. It was at Kevin Furtney's church. Kevin, are you in here? No, I saw him just a minute ago. I knew he was in here. And he told me afterwards that story entered him, it's where she has been so deeply wounded, but it gave her freedom. She just said, man, I gotta be free of this, right? And I said, you know what? The Lord freed me, because when you bless the people that bruise you, you find freedom. That's why Jesus says, love your enemies. It's not because it does anything for them as much as it does something for you. It gives you freedom, right? So a story can often do that, right? It can invoke emotions that lie dormant, and you realize, oh man, yeah, okay? It can be dramatic, it can be humorous, it can be sad, it can be joyous. So let's talk about elements of a memorable story. It has a single theme when you tell a story, okay? The theme's defined. When you get to the end of the story, people will be able to say, well, yeah, he started there and he brought me here. You know, you got to go somewhere with the story. Don't be one of these preachers who go, that's a great story. I just got to cram it in somewhere. Right? It actually has to take you somewhere. And at the end of it, there should be some sense of, that's where we were, and now this is where we've arrived with this story. We've arrived at a place of understanding. We've arrived at a place of illustration. We've arrived at a place of clarity. But it should have that deliberateness to it. It has a well-developed plot. And depending on the length, of course. Style, it should have vivid word pictures. I am grieved that we have become so lazy with language. I remember, I'm trying to think who it was. I was listening to a famous preacher. I lived in the U.S. for 11 years, so I got to be around some famous preachers. And I remember this guy saying, and when they did that in their church, there was 3 cheers in the boardroom of hell. Wow. Just the vividness of that language, you know what I mean? 3 cheers in the boardroom of hell. It was like, you know, as opposed to saying, well, they did that and I don't think that was a good thing. See the difference in that? And that was how the story culminated. So stories should have that vivid, choose your language carefully. Word hippo. Who knows word hippo? Best online thesaurus. There's a richness to language, right? Choose your words carefully and choose your words well in your story. It builds it out. It makes it so much more powerful. Pleasing sounds and rhythm. You know, a story, you have to tell a story well. And there we were so angry, we were so agitated, we were so upset. You know, don't we say, yeah, we did that, we were so happy. It was just the joy of the Lord we were experiencing. You want to yell, well, tell your face, right? You want to make sure that this thing, rides well and it makes sense as you tell a good story, okay? Integrity. If it's not true, don't couch it like it is. I was in a really large church one time in South Carolina in the first service, and I knew the pastor, and he told a story. It was one of these chicken soup for the soul deals, and I knew it wasn't a true story. So I had to go up and tell him between the two. I said, Don, just so you know, that is not a true story. He goes, oh, it's not. I said, no. So when you're telling a story and you're couching it as sort of a real event, what are people in the audience doing?
Checking their phones.
Checking their phones. Right? So now you've just sort of led on like this is factual. And what are they thinking about the rest of the next 30 minutes after your opening story?
Can't trust it.
Can't trust it. Is this really true? Is this, so you want to be very careful on your sourcing and whatnot. And if you're not sure, just say, I heard the story, I don't know, but it just helps us to understand and tell it that way. Just couch it, but don't let on like this is, if it's not your story, don't make it your story. Right? I actually heard a preacher one time preach a sermon story / illustration, let on it like it was his own. It was out of an Alistair Begg book. He let on like it was his own. And I had just read the thing like a week or two before. I thought, oh my word. So, just have integrity, okay? It should be well delivered. It should be there should be an appropriateness to the listeners. So if you're in a fellowship church and most people are north of 50, don't tell a lengthy story about Nirvana. Right? Because there's not an appropriateness to that. If it's a story that's, kind of rough and ragged and there's a large audience of children, be very careful about that. A friend of mine went to speak at a camp and I should have a spoiler alert for this, but he went to speak at a camp and he told all the kids, just like Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny, that's not true. I thought Santa was true. So needless to say, the camp director had quite a few calls from parents that had Santa ruined for their children. So just know your audience. You have to know your audience, okay? I'll tell you some things when we get to humor, okay? Elements for delivering a story. So how do I deliver a story well? So dialogue should make use of different voices. So some people can track better than other people, but if you're telling a story and it's got two different people, so my wife, I say to my wife, I don't think we better do that. And she, of course, she says, oh, it'll be okay, And so people get a sense as well. So then I said, well, that's not going to work. And she said, and people are, and you're going fast and it gets confusing. So you have to tell it well and help people understand. That's when you shift to represent different people and dialogue is switching, okay? Use your voice to create the atmosphere or tension. We were weeping. We were weeping. Right? Don't sit up there, oh yeah, people are kind of crying, they're kind of upset. That happens, I guess. If people are weeping, tell it like that. And if you're joyful, say, oh, God was so good to us. He was so good to us. If you believe it, and that's a don't tell a story you don't believe. So if you're telling it, it's because you believe it, then make it look like you believe it. And tell it well. Okay? And use your voice to do that, or tension as the story progresses. But it should match what's happening in the story. Use your gestures and facial expressions to add to the visualization of the story. And make sure they're appropriate and practice them. Some people have funky gestures. I know a pastor used to always take his glasses off and do this. So then, as he was telling the story, and I'd be like, I want to yell, stop spinning your glasses! Right? It just became a massive distraction. Now, if you're married, your spouse will be able to tell you your quirky habits fairly quickly, okay? But practice if you're going to, and if you're going to tell a story where, there's a lot hinging on the story, a Good Friday service or an Easter Sunday, and you're going to tell a, 3 or 5 minutes story at the end to bring all this to crescendo. Practice that so you get it down. And I'm going to demonstrate that here in a minute, just show you something that I did. But you need to practice that. So that, in front of your wife or a couple of your staff members. I used to do that when I was pastoring. Say, okay, I'm going to tell the story. You guys tell me. And they say, oh, that was a bit distracting, or we lost you a little bit for a minute, or whatever. Because you want it, economy of words, tighten it up, boom, right? Okay? Sometimes less is more, okay? Pacing involves volume and rate at which you speak. Be careful with your voice when you're telling a story, because sometimes we drop our voice, right? So if you're going to drop your voice and you're going to say something really critical, be careful that the person running your sound knows that, so it doesn't drop out so badly. You put the compressor on, it drops out, and the line that brings the crescendo to the story is lots of go, what did he say? What did he say? What did he say? Did you hear what he said? Right? So you want to be careful. But at the same time, voice volume and whatnot does make for a good story, okay? Really important. Master storyteller, he's pretty old now, Chuck Swindoll. Master storyteller. Listen to some of his older stuff. He's just masterful at it. Dialogue slows the story's pace down, while narrating action speeds it up, right? So if you're doing like people are talking, it's going to, but if you're just telling the story, what's going on, sort of the telling it as a narration, you can go a little faster. Repetition and exaggeration have always been basic elements of storytelling. Repetition and exaggeration have always been basic elements of storytelling. Right? So in the story I told you about the parents that lost the baby, I'm going, God, where are you? And all through that. And then finally, then you bring the crescendo. And I think in my message, God, where are you? You know where he is? He's weeping with you. He's weeping with you. Scriptures tell us that, right? But you're driving that, so that when you do come to release the tension, they've heard that, then they grab a hold of that, because you've said that so many times. Oh, you grab one. He's weeping, he's there weeping with you, right? We do not have a high priest that doesn't know what this world brings, right? So, repeat and exaggerate a little bit. Okay, let me go. My notes are a little different. Okay, what do? Do some do's for good storytelling, okay? Consider your audience, right? So who's in the crowd? A framework and details that will best resonate with your listeners. So if in a few weeks I'm speaking to a seniors group, okay? So I'm going to be sensitive to what that group's about, right? If I used to speak to younger people. I went and spoke to my daughter's group when she was in junior high. And I went in there, and when I was done, it was like that thing went over like a pregnant pole vaulter. It was just like, and I get home, my wife says, so how did you do with Riley's junior high? I said, I think it was a dud. And I said, I think I'm just too fat and old for junior high kids anymore. And she goes, oh, I'm sure it was great. So Riley comes home, and I say, I'm looking, please, Riley, stroke my ego that it wasn't as bad as I think it was. So I said, Riley, I'm sorry, I don't think that really went. Maybe I'm just too old for junior high. And Riley says, yeah, probably. Right? So, you got to be appropriate for the group at hand. Eh? Identify the message you want to impart. I always think in terms, one time I was talking to Charles Price. I said, Charles, I always ask really good preachers, especially if they've been preaching for a long time, or really good teachers, I say, is there anything you would do differently in your preaching or teaching ministry? That's a standard question. So when Charles was up at NBC last year, we were sitting talking, I said, I want to ask you a question. So I asked him that question, and he said, I thought this was very interesting. He said, well, I'm not sure there's anything I would change, but he said, I'll tell you what I do. When I'm ready to preach, I say to myself, can a 10-year-old carry this out? What does I want the 10-year-old to carry out when I'm done with my message? And I would say with a story, what is the handle that you are going to put on that story? Right? So what I told you before, where is God? He's there weeping with you. God is right here. When I'm weeping, he's weeping with me. He understands what I'm feeling. He's right here with me. He's ever present, right? So you want to identify what you want to impart, and then find inspiration in your own life experiences. Okay? In your own life experiences. Find inspiration in those things. Tell stories about yourself. Stay current. Don't be getting up and thinking, the high school kids and the young adults are going to identify with a story from My Three Sons. Now, you see, you got to be old to understand what My Three Sons is, right? Right? So stay current on what's happening, what's going on. Gauge the story based on the impact. So if it's a little little sort of winsome little thing, don't spend 5 minutes on it. Now, if it's a big, high impact, return on investment story, then that's a different thing. But gauge, is this the kind of thing where, people will have this, the culmination of the story will be, whoa, 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 whoa. Think of Jesus, right? Yeah, you know what? You've answered correctly. Go and do likewise. Right? For that guy, that's a whoa, 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 I got to do that. Don't think differently. Actually, go and live like that. So gauge your story and the potential impact of it, and then work towards that. Don't assume you don't have any stories to tell. Everybody's got stories to tell. One of the things that I have been blessed with and cursed with is I have a pretty good memory. So I remember things that, I can't remember what happened yesterday. I'm talking about 30 years ago. I can remember things, right? Lots of times something happens to you. If you're teaching or preaching regularly, something happens and you go, and you're not sure what to do with that. Write that little story down in 4 or 5 sentences and file it away somewhere, because down the road. So I'll tell you an experience where this happened to me. A year ago Easter, so almost right now, a year ago Easter, I live out in the country on a rural road, and every spring and every fall, I go along the ditch in front of my house. And because during the winter, people throw trash out, okay? So I have a tractor, and I go around, I just throw all the garbage in the bucket of the tractor. So a week before Easter, I'm going along, and I'm throwing all this trash, and I get right to the edge of my property, and I look down, and I go, that's interesting. And I climb down into the ditch, which has water in it, and I reach down into the water, and I grab a bag out of the water, and I pull it up. And as soon as I picked it up, I said, I think I know what this is. And I set that bag down in front of my tractor on the side of the road, and I opened it up, and in the bag was a human hand. I made that part up. And I've done that, when I've told the story, I've done that. But then I say this, but not completely, because it was a bag from a funeral home with a human remains urn in it. Right? And I took that, and there was a Bible in there, and I took it, and I brought it up to my house, and I said to my wife, you're never going to guess what I found in the ditch, so I'm not going to ask you to. And my wife's going, get it out of here, that's weird. And so I didn't know what to do with it. I finally ended up phoning the police. They said, yeah, we'll come and get it. And this young police officer came, and he said, wow, that's really weird. And he said, well, there should be a name in the bottom of the remains. And so this young guy, he looked like, I said, like, did you become a policeman right when you got out of grade 7 or what? I mean, he looked like 17 young. Anyway, really super guy. So he reached out, found the name. Of course, I make a mental note of the name, and I go in. What do you think I do? Google the name. Lady had died 12 years before. But that bag hadn't been in the ditch for 12 years because I clean the ditch out every spring and fall. And she had died of a COPD kind of thing at 42 years of age. I live in Cambridge. She was from Kitchener. So I thought, that's really weird. I didn't know what to do with that story. But then I was working on a sermon about a month or two later, and it began to develop into, and I've used that story about, you know what happens in the world? You get cast off. The world casts people off. Who gets the remains when somebody dies? Family. So either the family put Myrtle, her name's not Myrtle, put Myrtle on the roof of the car and drove away, and Myrtle ended up in my ditch, or they hated Myrtle when somebody opened the door and said, see ya, Myrtle, out the window. You get cast off. But in Christ, you're not ever cast off. You're called home. You're called home. It's the exact opposite of what the world does. So you might not know immediately, so record things, remember things. Even little things, sometimes some little experience happens to you in life, and you think, man, I don't know what this means in this moment, but it may come into focus for you down the road, but you won't remember it. You won't. I have actually people come up to you and say, I remember one time when you were at Forward, you told this story about something that happened to you, and I go, yeah, and I was like, yeah. But I hadn't remembered it, but they had remembered it. God had used it and impacted them in some way, okay? So, don't overwhelm your story. Don't always give yourself or never give yourself the starring role. Some stories, you're in the center, but don't always be, let me tell you about me. Humility and how I achieved it. So, be careful about that, right? Okay? Don't overwhelm your story with unnecessary details. This is where some people get mired down. Yeah, we were driving in the car. I think it was my dad's Buick. No, it might have been an Oldsmobile. Doesn't matter. You're in your dad's. Okay. So economy of words. Okay. If you practice your story, or you write out, even if you are going to tell the story, sort of without any note, you're just going to tell it, which is always best if you can get to that point. Write it down, and then cull it out and say, that doesn't really add anything. It just is busyness, and so cull it out and get a nice, tight, clean thing. If it doesn't contribute, pull it out, throw it away. Okay. Repeat. Keep a log of the stories you told and when. That's important to me because I now am preaching in different churches. I'm not in a church. So whenever I go and preach at a church, I always keep a copy of that sermon. I write down the stories, the illustrations that I've used, because there's nothing worse than you're in a church and you go back 6 months later and you tell the same story. That's a dog, right? That's a bad one, right? So be careful about that, okay? So use of a story. Won't spend much time here. Illustration, application, parable, sermon wraparound. Okay? So the story I told at Kevin Furtney's church a few weeks ago, I started out, I said, how many of us here have been hurt? Like, hurt. Life has dinged you, and you've had a hurt that you have hung on to. Sometimes you don't even realize how much you've hung on to. So then I told this story, which I started to tell you a few minutes ago, about a guy I worked for who, when I was 15, embarrassed me in front of, I worked at a Canadian Tire store. He owned the Canadian Tire. And he embarrassed me in front, it was a busy Saturday, customers, staff. He just took me and just squashed me like a bug. And that put a root of bitterness in me, and it just got worse and worse. Finally, I got fired from the job. It was the only job I've ever been fired from, was that job, because I just got through. I hated the guy, and it just got worse and worse, and so I'm fired. I'm done. 35 years later, a guy in my church calls me one Sunday and said, my dad's gone missing. They can't find my dad, and he's missing in a park. Long story short, because I already told you. I said, I'll go and help look, because I'm paid to be nice. I was a pastor. And so I go over to the park, and they had the police in the park half the day looking, couldn't find him. So I went over to the park. It's a Sunday night, holiday weekend in August. Park's full of people, there's ducks. And of course, the ducks come towards me. They said, there's a fat guy, he'll have bread. And so they're on, wah, 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 wah. They're coming at me. I can't hear, and I'm walking along, and there's woods, thick woods over here on the other side of a creek. And I for some reason, I walk over to the woods, and I go, is there anybody in there? And I'm like, I think I just heard something. And I yelled again, is there anybody in there? And I heard this really faint voice, help. And I looked in really carefully, and I looked way in, and I saw this little bit of red fabric. And I said, stay right there, we're going to get help. And I phoned my friend, Andy. I said, Andy, I think I just found your dad. He said, where are you? And I said, it's a big park. He said, I'm at the other end, I'm coming down there. I said, well, get off, I'm going to phone 911, because I don't think we're going to be able to get him. He's way in these woods, and it's all weeds and vines and everything. So the paramedics come, the fire department chainsawed in to get the guy. That's how dense it was. So he went for a walk in the morning, fell, got up, fell again, hurt himself, had a heart attack. He'd been in there since 7 in the morning. This was 7, and he'd been there 12 hours. The paramedic said, how did you find him? I said, well, actually, to tell you the truth, God helped me, which they thought was funny. But I said, no, actually, that's what happened. And they said, well, if you hadn't found him, he would have died overnight. He never would have lived through the night. He was in the hospital for a month. Anyways, they carry the guy out. He was the guy that owned the Canadian Tire. So I was able to bless the man that bruised me so badly 40 years before. And I drove home that night, and I realized the Lord had lifted something from me. So that's a wraparound story. Part of it was at the beginning of the message, and then part of it was at the end, right? So you can use story really well like that, because people don't expect. Who's the guy who used to be on the radio? The rest of the story or something like that? What was his name?
Paul Harvey.
Paul Harvey.
Paul Harvey, yeah, Paul Harvey. So, yeah. So there's a wraparound, okay? 6 sources for stories. The Bible, okay? The best stories, if you're going to use a story to illustrate a passage, sometimes extract the story first and foremost from another section of the Bible. Go over, find a story that you can use. Use the Bible to teach itself, okay? Books on stories. There's lots of good books. Somebody gave me a little book. I meant to bring it, and I forgot to do it. It's the book of amazing stories or something, and it's all from a Christian perspective. It's just a little book. There's some great stories in it. So there's lots of those, but verify. Don't just because they bought 5 gallons of printer's ink, don't think that it's necessarily exactly true, right, whatever. Okay, so personal experiences, right? So things that have happened to you, that you've experienced. And then others experiences. So other people, they'll come and they'll tell you something, but get permission. And my personal policy is if they have any hesitancy, I don't try and push them. I just say, okay, no problem. I figure I just take that as from the Lord. But get permission. My kids, when I was pastoring, if I told a story and they were in it, they got $10. Okay? So, anyways, okay? But God will use that. My son, in fact, I just told my grandsons on Saturday night, they stayed overnight with us. My son, Spencer, he pastors Church of the City, which is a fellowship church in Guelph. And Spencer has been perfect in every way. He's never given us 5 minutes of trouble. The only thing that he did that was really quirky is 2 hours after getting his driver's license, he drove down our street and smashed right into a car. Yeah, so how's that driving working out so far? And which I paid for because, When you're 16, you don't have any money. So I told his son, I told him this story. They were lying in bed. I said, okay, Pops is going to tell you a story. And I said, yeah, and this kid drove it. And at the end, my oldest grandson, who's about 9, says, was that my dad? It was awesome. I was like, actually it was. But Spencer gave me permission to tell that on a Sunday morning. I forget what the context was, But, but he was okay with it. He was totally okay with it. So I wouldn't have otherwise. Historical reading. So there's lots of good historical writing going on. Some of the writing is just replete with powerful, amazing stories. So you can read widely. Okay, just don't read in the Christian stream, as important as that is, obviously. Read widely. Biographies. Okay, great stuff in biographies. Steve Jobs, his biography, very interesting stuff in there. Interesting people, Everybody has an Uncle Mort. An uncle, if you don't have Uncle Mort in your family, it could be you, actually. But every family has an Uncle Mort, that has interesting stories. I know this guy, or something happened to him, and he remembers. I think I'm maybe the Uncle Mort in my family. I'm a little worried about that. But interesting people, okay? And so those are some sources for stories. But again, capture them, write them down, get a hold of them, or you're going to lose them. Let me talk a bit about humor, okay, for a few minutes. Can we do that? Humor can be a really powerful teaching and preaching tool, okay? Why do we use humor? To build rapport, especially if you're speaking to a new audience. Because if you get up and you speak to a new audience, you will actually have to give them permission to laugh and engage, because they don't know who you are and they don't know how to adjust for you and how, and they're also saying, where's Pastor Fred? We want Pastor Fred. Why are you here? Where's Pastor? So it'll build rapport. So you can do that fairly quickly, right? Sometimes to illustrate a sermon point, a bit of humor, right? Okay. So, no man can serve two masters. That's true. And it's not talking about polygamy. See, now there's humor. That's a very small joke, apparently, but it is humor. Okay? It's very small, very small. Okay. So, but sometimes you can use some humor to illustrate a point, right? Or to apply a sermon point. Sometimes you can use humor to release tension or awkwardness. Right? So a friend of mine on his very first Sunday at his church, he went up and was walking literally onto the platform, and something went with the sound system. Have you ever noticed that most sound systems should be named Jezebel? Have you ever noticed that? So he's stepping up on the platform, and I was like, this is the sound system. Go, and he said, I never expected to be welcomed by a tugboat. So yeah, everybody laughed, and so instead of everybody going, what did the sound guy do, and make him feel bad because something just happened, and those things happen, the humor took the awkwardness out of that, right, and just released it. So if you're doing a lot of speaking and preaching or whatever, you should have a few funny lines in your toolkit, that you can use, that are appropriate and, to build rapport. I was speaking at a Presbyterian church several years ago, and I got up and I said, the most intriguing thing, I said, I'm a Baptist, so forgive me, but I said, you Presbyterians are intriguing. Just so intriguing, because everyone's listening. I said, the most intriguing thing to me, this is just me speaking, about Presbyterians, and you're intriguing, is that if you take the word Presbyterians and rearrange it, it spells Britney Spears. That's intriguing to me. So some of the people found it funny, actually. So then you know what every high school kid's doing? They got their phone number. How do you spell? So, but it builds rapport. Everybody laughed, right? It was kind of fun, and, so you can use that, okay, to do that. It increases openness in the immediate. So Howard Hendricks used to always say, if you use humor, maybe the most impactful thing that you say after everybody laughs is the next thing. Everybody laughs. So I did a sermon one time on David's sin. And I had one of our facilities guys, I said, I need like 300 pieces of 2x4 cut this long. And he said, oh, okay. So, and then we had our service director set them up all around. We had, big platform all around, like dominoes all around. And then they went up. We went up in a big thing, up to a great big thing, and it fell down. So then I reached over and I said, here's a domino. This domino is called David Looks Off the Rooftop. And then it went around. That one there is Bathsheba just came to meet with him on the rooftop. Went around a little farther. David goes after her husband. And it goes up and it goes up. And this fell down. And when this fell down, everybody laughed. And as soon as everybody stopped laughing, I said, but it's not that funny if your whole family collapses over your sin. I looked out. There was a couple of guys in our congregation with tears running down. Because their sin had just been, right? So often after the laughter, because people have, what have they done? They've let the guard down, right? They've let the guard down. And then you can speak into that void, speak into that space, okay? To create a break from current distractions. So sometimes something happens in a service, if it's appropriate, you could do, there's a crash or something happens or the sound system packs it in or whatever, right? So humor can help with that. Okay, types of humor. Observational. Okay, so observational. So you notice something in the service. Now, churches have these numbers. You ever, these kids' numbers? Some churches have these numbers. So I went into church, I was speaking, and they had a number, so if your kid is, barfed or pooped or something, they put a number up there, So I'm talking, and then all of a sudden, I could tell the number's gone on because I noticed all the heads go, right? So I said, oh, that's table 42 at Swiss Chalet. You're ready to be seated, right? So it went over about like that, actually. Yeah. In my head, it was funnier. Okay, but that's an observational, just something, and don't embarrass it. But sometimes just observational humor, it just comes to you in the moment, right? And it can anecdotal. Okay, you talk about your own life. Have you ever done anything really dumb like this? One time, but they can find themselves in your anecdote, your story, your thing, right? Situational humor. So it has wide application, wide familiarity. Have you ever said something really stupid in a group? Or have you ever said something really dumb around the family table? Have you ever done anything really inappropriate? Let me tell you what I did. I'll tell you something I did. I actually use this as humor. We have some really good friends, and they're much more refined than I am. And they bought a very expensive dining room. This is 25 years ago. Bought a very expensive dining room setup, like 12 chairs. And to commemorate that, they decided to have a formal dinner party. And they had a big, beautiful home. So they had this formal dinner party, and everybody had to get dressed up fancy. We're all dressed up fancy. Women got all these beautiful dresses. We all got neckties on. We go to this dinner party. And we're sitting around the table, and they actually had somebody bring in food. I think somebody served it, if I remember. It was really fancy. And everybody's eating, and I think it was prime rib, and they had the gravy or the sauce or whatever. And for some reason that only the Lord knows, I thought it might be helpful if all the sauce that had went down the spout of the gravy boat, that I just give it one of these. And about halfway through my wife says, "What are you doing?" And yeah, true story, absolutely true story. Like to this day, everybody, the 12 people there, remember that time Adam's licked? So, but people can relate to that, right? And self-deprecating, we've all done really things where you go, what in the, at least I have, maybe you haven't, where you go, what in the world was happening? What was I doing, right? Okay? So, situational. One-liner, okay? So one-liner is humor that, very tight, right? What's the difference between a Baptist and a Methodist? The Baptist won't wave at you in the liquor store. You know, it's a one-liner. Don't use that on the side. So, but that's, you know, one-liner. Very tight like that. I got that from Doug Blair, by the way. I just want you to know. Irony. Two opposing thoughts are putting tension on each other. What show was the master of irony? Seinfeld. Right? There's always these back and forth kind of things, right? Okay? Deadpan. Right? Deadpan, right? So you go, you know, that's and we experienced the joy of the Lord while we sat through that service. And the accordion player played the 14th song. I'll tell you an accordion story here in a second. Self-deprecating, I've already talked about that, right? Okay, and again, there's another Seinfeld thing, self-deprecating humor, big in Seinfeld, right? Like so, and the good part about that is, you know, humor always has risks. So humor that is, you know, directed towards yourself, right, is a little safer. Okay, humor gives people a different way to process a thought. Okay, so that's a key to why you'd want to use it, and it disrupts their expectations. It kind of surprises them, right? Surprises them. Oh. So, you know, that catches them a bit off guard. Now, what are some of the risks? Because all humor has an element of risk, okay? So here's some cautions. One Sunday morning, I said, so I was in the lineup at the grocery store, and there was a really heavy-set guy behind me. You know, I'm overweight, so I figured that's pretty safe. You know, I'm talking sort of my own experience. I said, there was a really heavy-set guy behind me, and he had a sweatshirt on, and on the front of the sweatshirt it said, guess. So I turned to him and I said, I don't know, 375? I thought it was kind of funny. And a lady in our congregation, who her and her husband were fairly heavy-set, phoned me on Monday.
She said she was 375?
No. She said a number of things. But they were hurt. They were really hurt. So what do you do in that situation? You say, I'm really sorry. That was careless, and I'm sorry that was hurtful. And you know what? To this day, they send money to Feb Central to support me in the work I do to Feb Central. That couple, right? You know, if I would have said, oh, it's not that big a deal, like, you shouldn't get your feelings hurt. But you got to be careful, right? If you overstep and it's hurtful, own it. Just own it, right? It takes the heat out of it. And she was really gracious and loving. It was just really hurtful to us, right? Like it was just, and I said, no, fair enough. You know, so there is a danger. Humor is regional and cultural. So sometimes what's funny in one place is not funny somewhere else, and vice versa, right? So you have to know that. I'm in Russia one time, and I'm teaching through a translator named Leo. And I said, Leo, I got this joke I want to start off. I was talking about, you know, a topic, something like this. And I said, this guy goes to seminary and he takes a class, and it's a class in preaching, and the assignment is you take the first 3 words of the Bible and you preach for 30 minutes on it. So I said, this guy, he prepares for months for his final grade in the preaching class on the first 3 words of the Bible, and he preaches for 30 minutes on his topic, and his sermon is entitled Genuine Bonded Leather. That was kind of funny, right? And so Leo, translator, I said, Leo, oh, very funny joke. It will be very funny. I'll tell it in Russian. The people, they're very funny. They'll laugh. I get this name, and Leo said, and don't let the brutal, don't let the whole crowd did. I could feel Scud missiles coming at me from eyes. Like it just didn't go, right? It just made no sense when it was taken over to Russian. So you got to be careful of that and be aware of that, okay? You need to know the audience, right? Like know your audience. Even in my own church, right? I got into trouble with that. Years ago, I was speaking on Long Island, New York, in a Pentecostal church, and I was doing a seminar on Saturday, and then I was preaching No, I was teaching a seminar, and I was with another guy, and my buddy was preaching on Sunday. But anyways, I started on Saturday, and I thought, I'll warm the audience up with a little humor. And I'd heard this little one-liner kind of joke, and I thought, oh, they'll think it's funny. So I said, hey, what's the definition of perfect pitch? I said, it's when you throw the accordion in the dumpster and it lands on the banjo. The pastor's wife, New York State seniors accordion champion. Right? So it's a winner right from the get-go. Right from the start, right? Okay? Good jokes are often old jokes, okay, meaning they've all heard it before. If you're going to get up and you're going to start off with some joke or whatever, make sure nobody told it 2 weeks ago on a Sunday morning. Like, ask the worship guy, David Paul, say, David, I'm preaching at his church in a couple of weeks. And say, has anybody heard that? Oh, no, that's fine. No, we've never heard that. Because, often, especially with the internet, social media, a joke, everybody's heard it by the time you use it, and then it goes over like, oh, this guy, come on, man. Like that, I heard that 6 months ago, right? I've heard it 10 times. You get up there and you think it's funny, and then it's like, oh, falls on his face, right? Test fly your humor. Here's the thing, a caution. If you get a check in your spirit about it, don't use it. The devil's sitting on your shoulder saying, it'll be okay, go for it. But if you think, oh, this might be on the line or a bit past, don't use it, right? It's just not good. Take that as the unction of the Spirit, okay? Don't preach humor. Like, don't get preachy about trying to tell a joke. Like, there's funny stories and there's funny ways to tell a story. Agreed? Right? Why did everybody laugh at Kramer? Because he told funny stories, and he was funny just in the way he would tell these silly stories, So, have some winsomeness about it, okay? Don't create confusion through misunderstanding. So sometimes you tell something funny or a funny story or funny joke, and then people go, well, was that true, or was that just a joke, or what? And that can create some confusion. So just be aware of that, okay, and be sensitive to that. Okay. That's what I have for you, I believe. Oh, sources for humor. Let me just tap on this for a second, okay? Your own personal experiences. And again, if something funny happens to you, write it down. Capture it. So I used to have a big, and some of you have been preaching a lot longer than I have, but I used to have, big drawer full of sermon illustrations and jokes and everything. Then I put it online, on the cloud, and but write that stuff down, right? Stick it in a file or whatever. The other thing is, let me just encourage you, for those of you who are teaching and preaching all the time, if you tell a story or a funny joke or whatever, and you're writing out your sermon, don't put in it illustration, Mark's car. Because you were out with Mark Cuthbert, and he told you he had this funny thing where his car broke down 3 times the same day or something. It was really funny, and because 5 years from now, you're going to say, what in the world is Mark's car? Like that, it won't mean anything to you, you know what I mean? But the week you wrote it meant something. But if you're ever going to use that story or tell that story again, you're not going to have, it'll be gone. So you need to have some meat on the bones, so you'll stimulate your memory, so collect those, okay? So your personal experiences, your fails, and your firsts, okay? Keeping a humor file. So keep, as I've mentioned, okay? Charming and enjoyable can be a substitute for hilarious. You don't have to have the funniest thing on earth. So I'll give you an example of this. When I was pastoring, we used to take 150 kids for a week up to Camp Minio. We pay the whole freight, and about half of those kids would be neighborhood kids, like kids with non-church kids. And we'd book a big chunk of Camp Minio for the first week of July, because they didn't have campers come until the next week. So we'd spend all this money to take these kids up. So one year we take these kids up, and the end of the week comes, and all the boys that are like 7 years old, the end of the week comes, and I'm standing out in the field in front of all the cabins, and this cabin leader comes out and he says, everybody come and look in the sink. There's a pair of underwear in the sink. See if it's your underwear. So all the kids go marching back in. Kids, not my underwear. Not my underwear. Not my underwear. So one kid's out in the field playing soccer, and the cabin leader says, Thomas, come and look and see if these are your underwear. They're not my underwear. Thomas, come and look in the sink. They could be your underwear. No, there's nobody else's. They must be yours. They're not my underwear. How do you know they're not your underwear? Because I didn't bring no underwear. Right? So it's not hilarious, but it's winsome, and so you tie that into sometimes you can be assured even though everybody else thinks you can't be assured. That kind of thing. So let me tell you another source for story and humor. Vocabulary. I mentioned this before. If you have your phone, I'll tell you what to do. Take your phone out and Google Salvator Mundi. And I'll just try and show you some storytelling with this little illustration where this will be done. Okay? Salvator Mundi. Does anybody know what that is? Any art people in here? Okay? If you got it, hold it up. Hold it up. Yeah. Okay. So, I'm reading a book one day, and this is a few weeks before Easter, and I read a word, pentimento. Does anybody know that word? Pentimento. Vocabulary is an incredible place for story and illustration. Just vocabulary. So I'm reading this book, and the story is, in the thing is pentimento. I've never heard the word. I'm like, what is that word mean? Pentimento. Anybody here into art? It's an art term. It's Italian, obviously. It's an art term. A pentimento is a painting that's basically a do-over. Okay, so the artist paints it, and then they go, oh, I don't like that. So they paint in, and there's a shadow of the former, but it's been painted over. It's a do-over. So I look up, pentimento, I look it up. I find this word, I look it up, and I read this pentimento on Wikipedia. The most famous pentimento in the world is... Do you know what Salvator Mundi means?
Savior of the world.
Savior of the world. See, Patrick was a world-class opera singer, so he knows these kinds of things. He's very cultured. So I'm reading that called Salvator Mundi. Huh. So here's the story that comes from just one word that the Lord gives you. So it's Easter at our church, and I had a massive screen with Salvator Mundi on it. It's a Da Vinci, Leonardo da Vinci. It's a pentimento, and it has the, it was the most expensive painting ever sold at auction, $450 million. Well, like $500 million. So we put the painting up. So I want to show you a painting. This is Salvator Mundi, the Savior of the world. It says priceless, $450 million last time it sold. Who knows what it would sell for today? Maybe $1 billion? I don't know. The crazy thing about this painting, friends, is it's a do-over. It's a do-over. The most valuable piece of art in the world is a do-over. But guess what? It's not this painting. It's you. Because we're a do-over. We're a do-over. The sin was painted over with blood of Christ. Salvator Mundi, the Savior, painted over us with his own blood. We're a do-over. You are his poema, Paul tells us, his work of art. You're priceless. You're the most valuable piece of art in the world. But you were bought by Christ. That came all out of that little word. If I never would have looked that word up, I never would have had that. And you're free to use that in your next sermon if you want, any of you preacher teachers. I'd like $10. Would that be okay? You can e-transfer too. Okay, so very simple. Okay, if anybody comments, questions, I'll hang out. It's 9 minutes after, and I'm supposed to kick you out of here. I'm watching because Dr. Self over there. Oh yeah, look at these. Okay. Any questions, comments? Let me encourage you, if you haven't gone through our next level preaching, we'd love to have you do that. Be part of that. Send me an email at Feb Central or whatever. Or let us know. Let the office know. Again, it's practical stuff. We're not getting into exegesis and hermeneutics and whatnot. We're talking about practical tools. So we talk Ashwin Ramani, who you're going to hear tonight. He speaks on how to speak across different cultures when you're teaching and preaching. Okay, he's saved out of a Hindu background in India. So Rick Buck, how to put evangelism in your speaking. We talk about things like storytelling and humor. you know, just the very practical things of preaching. So if you want to be part of that, we'd love to be part of it. Okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're dismissed. Thanks for hanging out.